film about? What's it really about? What genre does it hit? What is really being said? What's really being seen? That's what you're talking about.
Hello and welcome once again to the Intermission Podcast. This is a podcast about content of all types, and I'm Nitin Sundar, as usual, joined by my good friend Narendra Banad, who today is also.
Hi, Nitin. Today you can call me Chris Ryan. He's the jack of all trades at the Ringer Podcast Network, one of my favorite podcasters.
So Chris Ryan from Ringer, jack of all trades in many ways, because Chris Ryan, a different Chris Ryan, also happens to be a very famous cricket writer. So bringing in intersections to the intermission from the other parts of my world, which is, of course, the cricket podcast that I'm a part of, the Bits and Pieces podcast. So yeah, so Chris Ryan is who Dodi is, and Chris Ryan from the Ringer Network, which kind of sets up what today's episode is going to be about. We are going to be talking about the state of the podcasting industry on a podcast. So, Dodi, let's
Where
take
do
it
we
away.
begin? So I'll tell you what. Why don't we start with your entry into podcasting? And by that, I don't even mean starting to podcast, but let's talk about when we discovered what podcasts were and how you started listening to podcasts, because I know we intersected a long time back on a particular podcast as well. So why don't you tell me when
Yeah,
you started listening?
I think I started listening to podcasts about 11, 12 years back. I think it was around 2012, where a friend of mine recommended a couple of podcasts to me. And I think the first two podcasts that I listened to were This American Life and Radio Lab, which continue to be two of the podcasts that I continue to subscribe to and listen to quite regularly. Also, two of the most popular old podcasts, right?
Yeah.
I know people still say podcasting is so nascent and everything, but it's actually been through multiple cycles, I feel, already, at least three cycles. And these are two podcasts that come from that very first phase of podcasting, right? This American Life was famously, or is even now, a radio show, which is also hosted as a podcast, right? It's part of Chicago Public Radio. And Radio Lab is a part of NPR's many offerings. Again, it's funded by, I don't know, it's funded by research grants and obviously also funded by listeners over the years. One of the best podcasts out there on science. Yeah, those were the two podcasts that got me into podcasting. And I think the big podcast or other podcast that got me hooked really, I think, would have to be Reply All, which for many years was my favorite podcast.
Mhm.
And there was this phase when I was listening to, I think, pretty much every podcast that Gimlet was putting out, and they were all very interesting. There was a podcast called Homecoming, if I remember right. There was,
Yes, Homecoming was
I
their
don't know, there were
first
so many
scripted
podcasts.
podcast.
Yeah, mystery podcast. There
Mm.
was, of course, Reply All. There was Startup, which of course is the most meta
Startup.
podcast of all podcasts, because it's a podcast about starting up. And the first season of the podcast Startup was about starting up a podcast business. So, yeah, it's the story of Gimlet itself, the very early days of Gimlet. So these were the podcasts that really got me hooked. And currently, I listen to about, I don't know, or at least I subscribe actively to
Mm.
about 50 podcasts. And there are a few subscriptions which I should probably unsubscribe from because I'm not listening to them, but they continue to be there on my podcast app. And yeah, I'm listening to podcasts all the time. And of course, now we are also creating podcasts. So last week is when I actually launched my fourth podcast. There has been obviously Bits and Pieces, the cricket podcast, which has now been around for a while, done with a bunch of friends. There was another cricket podcast, Heads and Tails, which has sort of gone into hibernation at the moment. We did about 20 episodes again with a friend of mine. There is, of course, the Intermission on movies. And then there's another new podcast called Leftover Lasagna, which is on various topics with a friend of mine, Tony Sebastian, who also is a part of the Bits and Pieces gang. So, yeah, also making podcasts now.
Congratulations on your fourth podcast. Welcome to
Yeah.
I say welcome as if I'm there, not me, but
You are
it's nice to see you
there.
enter into the content creator zone. So for me, podcasts, I'm trying to remember. I think the first was when, was it 2011? End of 2011 when I moved to Chennai when I got married. I basically ended up losing my BlackBerry. I was on BlackBerry at that point. I lost my BlackBerry in
About
Bangalore.
time.
Yes.
About time you lost that
Yeah.
BlackBerry.
And I ended up picking up an iPhone. I think it was 4, maybe iPhone 4G or something those
Yeah.
things were called. Yeah. So I got an iPhone. And while playing around with that, and if you remember early those days, Apple Podcast was the like place for proper distribution of podcast. Like the entire, if I'm not wrong, the etymology of podcast itself comes from
Yes.
Apple Podcast somewhere. The idea of
iPod. It comes from iPod. It's
iPod
all
and
part of the
podcast.
same
Yeah.
lexicon. Yeah.
So I said, what's this podcast thing? And then I clicked on it. I searched around. I used to read a lot of entertainment writers, right? Like, journalists talking about either TV or movies, whether it's A.O. Scott from the New York Times or whether our very own Alan Sepinwall from, at that time, he was still with the Ledger, I think, even before he moved to Hitfix. But I started subscribing to these guys basically. They all had a podcast at
Right.
that point. I started subscribing to them. Alan Sepinwall, for example, had this thing called Firewall and Iceberg, which was him and Dan Feinberg, who's now with THR, with the Hollywood Reporter. So a bunch of these, basically, I kind of swapped out some of my entertainment reading for listening. And my feed was entirely reviews or recaps or whatever those kind of podcasts. I was, needless to say, immediately hooked. At that time, I think they hadn't yet started the speeding up thing. I think that started much later. At that time, it did exist. As you know, now I've hit the 1.8x. I'm currently experimenting with 1.9x. So, in terms of consuming
Going
content
supersonic, Avi. Yeah.
fully. Uh, But yeah, so I was listening largely to entertainment. Excuse me. And I remember, can't remember what the context was. For some reason, we discussed some podcasts somehow. I think I met you in Chennai or
Yeah.
whatever. And you put me on to This American Life and Radio Lab. These were the two
Oh,
you put
oh,
me on.
really? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes. You put me on to these two. I said, I've heard of both of these, but I've never tried. So, okay, fine, let me try these. And I distinctly remember, I still remember which episode it was. I downloaded both these. They were on. I had not yet listened to them. We were doing a drive from, and I've told you this story, I think you might have forgotten. My wife and I were doing a drive from Chennai to Bangalore. She
Okay.
was, and in the car, so I started This American Life. And they had this, I don't know if you remember, Harper High. They did this special of 2 episodes in
Yes.
Harper High.
Yeah. The school. Yeah.
Yeah, the school, which for me directly hit at the Wire season 4 kind of feeling,
Yes.
right? And I distinctly remember about halfway through that episode, I stopped on the side of the road. I cried a little bit. I was like, man, I'm totally in. So that's when I started to kind of step out of the pure entertainment zone of the podcast I was listening to.
Yeah.
Tal, this, that. Other stuff, obviously, Gimlet. By then, we started, I think, sharing recommendations fairly often. Startup, we were both listening to more or less together. We would keep discussing
Yeah.
Alex Bloomberg and the one and only Nazneen.
Yes.
Nazneen? Nazneen, no?
Nazneen. Yes.
Nazneen. One and only Nazneen who
Yeah.
would slap him every time he came up with some stupid suggestion for what was that name?
Yeah.
Or Aurelia or Oral. Remember he made one name and she just came and laughed at him. So
Oh,
before
yeah, yeah,
Gimlet, she
yeah.
said,
No, I
what
don't
name should
remember.
I come
Yeah.
up with? And he said
For
something like
Gimlet. Yeah.
listening some aura, but Orial or something like that. And she just laughed. It was the most genuine laugh. Anyway, yeah, so even I was listening to a lot of these Gimlet ones. We used to discuss a bunch of reply all episodes and all that. I
Yeah.
think I've not really moved too far away from that space. Sports I have, of course, not touched at all, even though I listened to a lot of the Ringer. Ringer then came into existence a bunch of years later. I started listening to the couple of the Grantland podcasts, uh, which was Ringer before Ringer. Basically, Bill Simmons and we'll do the whole history later. But they were, as part of ESPN, they had this thing called Grantland, which was an
Yeah.
ESPN magazine, web
Yeah.
magazine or whatever, that was the intersection of sports and pop culture. So they had a few podcasts. Andy Greenwald had this thing called the Hollywood Prospectus, which has now
Right.
effectively become The Watch, which is Andy Greenwald and Chris Ryan, who I evoked earlier. So I started listening to them and slowly moved on to a bunch of other things. Bill Simmons used to do his interviews, a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, I think when did I really? go nuts over podcasts. I actually think when speed started, when I could like accelerate, I just started listening to so many. And I'm currently, I think, at the point I've been tracking this, by the way, because of Pocket Casts. I track the number of
Right.
hours that I listen. And I started Pocket Casts maybe during the pandemic is when I switched over to Pocket Casts. I've been jumping different podcast players. I think I'm now mostly locked into Pocket Casts unless they do something crazy. Is The stat I have is I listen for about 3 hours a day, little over 3 hours a day, to effectively about 6 hours worth of content. Is
Sounds good.
the current last two
Yeah,
years
yeah,
stat is roughly around that. It averages out to around 6 hours of content and 3 hours of listening, thanks to 1.9xing. But yeah, it's a fairly integral part of my consumption. A lot of news comes from there as well. Um,
yeah,
and I've gone in and out of podcasts. A lot of the stuff that you mentioned as well. There are podcasts I listened to, then stopped, and started again, or moved on to something else. For a brief while, I used to listen to all the Slate news podcasts, so I used to get news out of there. That stopped. So there's always a cycle of whatever, but there's some, I think, roughly similar. I have about 50 podcasts that I'm actively subscribed to, of which maybe 12 to 15 are very regular, and I listen to them as soon as they drop, whereas
yeah.
the others sometimes collect up and then I slowly work at the backlog and whatever else. And there are a few on top that have just been collecting episodes that I've not listened to that probably need to be culled at some point. Yeah, and like we discussed on our very first episode, we spoke about starting a podcast 10, I'll say at this point, 12 years ago. And
Yeah,
it finally came full circle and we finally started. So yeah, now on
indeed.
this side of the table.
I think we should talk about how and where people listen to podcasts and how that industry itself has
Yeah.
kind of evolved, right? Like, and you spoke a lot about your experience with podcasts. For me, it's become, and I wouldn't say become as in not. It's not something that happened recently. It has been a habit,
Mhm.
a very very dear habit, I would say, for many years now. Like if I'm going down to pick up groceries, for instance, right downstairs. I need to get my earphones on and I need to start listening to a podcast before I step out of my house. If
Yeah.
I'm doing dishes, I'm listening to a podcast. If I'm driving, obviously, I'm listening to a
Yeah.
podcast. There is no time of the day when I'm walking or running, except for the time when I want to listen to music, which typically I do if I'm sprinting. But otherwise,
Yeah.
it's mostly podcasts. Even when I do long runs, and there was a time when I was doing 10K and 20 kilometer runs, right, and I would
Yeah. I'm
burn through
I'm
podcasts
there as well.
during those runs.
I'm listening
Yeah,
in the shower also sometimes. Depends on
yeah.
who the voice
That's
is.
where I draw the
Because
line.
sometimes the shower voice is too loud, much louder. The shower noise is much louder. By the way, you will be, first of all, I think this is, in some sense, this is the podcast self-help group as well. People as addicted as we are talking about, like
Yeah,
finding 20 minutes
exactly.
to plug in your earphone in that time that you walk
Oh,
downstairs to throw the trash and come.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
in fact, so you mentioned listening to podcasts in showers, right? Like the only reason I don't is because I prefer to listen to podcasts with the earphones on
Mm.
because I can hear more
Earphones. I'm
clearly,
talking
right?
earphones only. I'm talking earphones.
Okay.
Anyway, waterproof. What
What
is that?
earphones do you use, Macha?
Yeah, earphones, waterproof earphones you get. What is that? It takes like
Okay,
splash
okay,
of
okay.
water. Don't worry, I'll send you some
Yeah,
links.
so
Oh, so you are still jujube in this game.
I
Has something to
I
do.
use so I by the way I'm currently one of my it's the small things in life that spark joy, right? So
Ah,
the earphones I'm currently wearing
yes, yes.
also, these are the earphones that I wear all the time when I'm running, when I'm listening to podcasts. So it's something that I put on for, like you said, about 3 hours a day
Yeah,
every day. This is a 600 rupee Boat earphones, okay, which
yeah.
I've now had for nearly 1.5 years.
Mm.
It is not waterproof. I mean, it is sweat proof,
Yeah,
and the proof of that is that I've done some very long runs, the
yeah.
kind of runs which the Bose Sound Sport,
Ah,
the sports Bose earphones could not survive.
mm.
So fairly intense sweating, but
Yeah.
these fellows have been quite fine with all of that. And I sometimes run on the beach, okay, and so there was this time when I was listening to a podcast running on the beach, finished my run,
Mm.
put my phone aside with whatever, my t-shirt and everything, removed my shades and all, and I got into the water.
Mm.
And as I put my head into the water, the podcast stopped playing. And I was like, wait a sec. Why was I even listening to a podcast right now? And then I remembered I still had my earphones on. These boys.
Yeah.
I immediately came out and put them away. Uh, and they continued working fine. I just had to try them out. So
Yeah.
there you go. I'm not Jujubi. I actually have cracked the scene with these fellows.
Here's the
But
thing. I'll tell
yeah,
you how
to
far my addiction has gone is that recently joined the health center here so that I can go swimming. I already experimented with these. They don't like it hits water, it cuts. That's the problem. The signal cuts.
yeah, yeah,
So you
signal
get
cuts. So
your
you need a waterproof phone. Actually, even a phone
not
wouldn't help
waterproof phone.
because
Or you need those.
Bluetooth doesn't work underwater. That's a problem.
Yeah. No, but there are apparently earphones that work underwater. I don't know what they do. I've already done some research on this. These are swimmer earphones where you can listen to. They have it for music, but for me, swimming especially is like you're doing half an hour, 45 minutes of like there's nothing else. There's your mind is
Yeah,
it's perfectly the best time to listen to a podcast
it
if you
is.
could
It is.
listen. So
It is.
apparently there's some swimmer earphones and all that you can get, swimmer earphones with those bone conducting or whatever that you can do. I'm researching much. Don't worry, I'll get there. But they were
Let
all
me
like
know. Let me know.
$200 and all. I was like, okay, no thanks. That is a bit much.
Yeah,
My addiction has not hit that level yet. But it will at some point. Or this will become
maybe
cheap.
another
Yeah.
maybe another 3 years we'll
Yeah.
have cheap solutions to this problem. But in
Correct.
fact, one of the reasons why I prefer running to swimming is exactly this. Like I can actually listen to stuff,
Yeah.
whereas while swimming, A, you can't see anything, B, you
Yeah.
can't listen to anything, right? So it's doubly boring in that
But
sense.
also I still carry the case there because when I get out of swimming pool and go into a steam and sauna, then I'm listening. I keep the phone outside. I put in the steam. I'm sitting and listening only. So don't worry. Every waking minute is still as much maximized as possible for podcast consumption.
Right.
Sorry.
So at this point, we should let our listeners know that if they did not already realize that we are crazy about podcasts, back in 2014, which is when I think phase two, the era two of podcasting officially kicked off with Sarah Koenig's Serial, which
Serial.
really was the podcast that made podcasting mainstream. Right.
Yeah,
I think lots of people started talking about podcasts, and it really was the entry podcast for
absolutely.
most people who listen to
Totally agree.
podcasts today. So when Serial launched, Dodi and I were part of a group of three people who would travel across Bangalore. And in my case, it was traveling from MG Road in Bangalore all the way to Sarjapur.
Hmm.
And this is like the worst possible traffic in probably the world to be doing at rush hour at 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m. on an evening. We used to do this so that we could do what we back then called podcast watch parties or
Yeah.
listen parties or
Listening.
whatever,
Yeah.
where we would just get together and say, okay, we are going to listen to this episode of Serial together this
Yeah.
evening. On the day it dropped, right? I
Yeah.
think we did that 2 or 3 times. There were totally 10 episodes of Serial.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Did that a few
at
times.
least three
Team of four.
episodes.
You and Shruti came, and we were doing it at
Oh,
Abhita's place.
yeah, actually, even
Also,
Shruti was also
yeah,
there. Yeah.
team of four. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Abhita,
Yeah.
Shruti,
Listening
me, and
parties
you.
as well. Yes. But yeah,
Listen parties.
good.
Yeah. So
Good
that's
point to bring up Serial. I think that is when, like you said, it went
yeah.
mainstream. A lot of people started listening. I think that's where, from a content perspective, it also
In
changed.
fact, that was sort of around the time when Gimlet sort of took off as well and really
Yes.
became
Yes.
visible as a brand, right? You had Heavyweight launching around then, you had Reply All,
Yeah.
which was going great guns, which definitely was the best show. So you had a lot of well-produced shows, right? These weren't interviews or conversations per se, and we'll get into that phase of podcasting shortly. But these were well-produced audio content, which was just great to listen to. It was
Mm.
informative, it was entertaining, it was thought-provoking, whatnot. Right. Yeah, that was phase two. So, yeah, so really phase three for me,
Mm.
at least as someone who was continuing to observe and watch and listen to that
Yeah.
industry. Phase three was when the pandemic hit, right?
Mm.
And suddenly you obviously had a explosion in tech itself around content creation, and audio as a content format really took off during the pandemic, right? If you remember, Clubhouse
Yes.
uh, came into life
Short-lived,
at that point in time. Very
burnt
short
like,
lived,
yeah.
burned through. Twitter Spaces came at around that time. You had a lot of live streaming happening on Instagram and on Twitter. Not was it on Twitter? Yeah, on Facebook also. You had people just
Mm.
going vertical video live, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly, content creation in the video or audio format became very easy, right?
Mm.
And anybody with a phone was out there trying to create some sort of content,
Yeah.
which I think is around the time Spotify also, at least in India, that's
Mm.
around the time Spotify really took off as a platform that people would listen to, right? Before that, you had, I think people before that largely still used to download their music, right, from
Yes.
websites like songs.pk if they were not actually using your Geo or Savan, which was the
One.
more evolved
Wasn't
user.
even, was it? Oh, yeah, it had become Geo Savan by then, yes. It was Savan.
Sorry.
Ghana was it?
Yeah, I actually meant Ghana or Savan. But yeah, Savan later becoming Geo Savan, right? Um, I think, in fact, I remember I subscribed to Spotify, or I installed Spotify sometime during the pandemic. Became a paying member of Spotify definitely during that time. That I remember quite vividly as well. And around that time is when globally you saw Spotify was trying to get into this podcasting game, which
Yes.
otherwise had not really evolved for many years. Apple was doing something there, but it was more like Apple had built the platform and people would come and drop their podcast there. But there was really no action happening in terms of monetization, in terms of making it big. But
You have,
Spotify came in a big way. And I think the acquisition of Gimlet
yes.
happened not exactly at that time. I think it happened a little before the pandemic itself. But we spoke about all the podcasts, the four podcasts that I know I'm a part of, right? I think Bits and Pieces was a post pandemic baby. It was actually a pandemic baby. But the idea of launching a cricket podcast amongst our group really germinated during the pandemic because that's when we realized all you really need
Hmm.
is a Zoom account, right?
Yeah.
And you need mics and whatnot.
Hmm.
By the way, I don't think you probably heard of Zoom before the pandemic. Uh, I
Some
didn't.
work I'd use, but not for this thing.
Not Zoom. We used to use other things, right? I don't remember what we used to have. Google Meet, I think, when we were on Google as a platform, and then we used to have Teams if you were on Microsoft platform. But Zoom was this new third-party player who nobody had heard of, right? Nobody had heard of, and it just emerged during the pandemic and obviously took off.
Hmm.
And now I know that a lot of podcasts, including this podcast,
Yeah.
are only possible because we use Zoom's recording feature,
Yeah.
right? It's become that easy to create podcasts. So for me, that is phase three,
Hmm.
where creation has become so simple
Yeah.
that if you were to you really have a situation now where there are more podcasts or podcast creators than there
Hmm.
are podcast listeners, right?
Yes.
For me, that's phase three.
Yeah. I would put up somewhere of a 2 to 2.5 between serial and pandemic, where Gimlet came up, Ringer happened, Wondery happened. People
Yeah,
realized there's something here.
Pineapple Media,
Pineapple Media,
Parcast, all these guys.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
People
Pushkin
realize,
Industries.
yeah, there's something here that can be a
Yeah,
monetizable, proper monetizable industry. In fact, even Serial spun out, right? Serial became an independent company out of this thing
yeah,
as. But all of those, they got a lot of investment. And they were able to do these high production value shows that required,
yes.
which is we'll get to what is happening to that entire segment at this point. But they were able to do these high concept, high production shows that required a lot of investment, time, effort to produce and to make. Uh, and all of these studios eventually, a few years down the line, struggled with monetization and needed somebody else to come and bail them out, or whatever it is. They needed the distribution, or they needed the um, ad side of expertise. So you had Wondery going either to Amazon, or you had Gimlet going to Spotify, like you said. Spotify's first big acquisition in the podcasting space, right?
Yeah, I think Gimlet and Parcast, I think, were
Gimlet and
acquired at
Podcast
roughly
were
the
the
same
first
time.
two. And
Yeah,
about 6 months later or something, they did Ringer.
Ringer as well. Yes.
Gimlet Podcast were both 150 million roughly, I think, and Gimlet was around 300 million or whatever, including stocks. The big thing that happened with with Ringer, is that they then put Bill Simmons in charge of the talk space,
Podcasting.
whatever they called it. I
Yeah.
think they call it talk audio, or maybe they call it podcasting. I'm not sure. I think they have a different phrase for it. But yeah, so you had all those creative houses turning up then. And now we have the situation which we'll come to, which is where everything has started to crumble because people haven't really figured out monetization. It's come back to that story all over again. Different people have tried different things, to be honest. Luminary tried the whole paid podcast approach, Patreon, but only for audio. Back in the day, that collapsed. There was one more that tried this pure paid podcast scenario, which didn't work. Another big name, I can't recall who that was. Uh, but yeah, it's really down to this, that high production shows, which I know you love, I also enjoy. High production shows require that kind of money, which you then need to
Yeah.
see that kind of return, which I don't think works in your high growth Spotify kind of place at this point. So let's just backtrack for a second and talk about what's happened at Spotify in the last 6 months to a year. Do you want to take this? I've been speaking for a while.
Yeah. See, firstly, there was another model, right? So Gimlet, which we also listened to in the startup podcast,
Hmm.
uh, used to do branded podcasts for a
Yes.
bunch of brands. And in fact, they were advertising those branded podcasts. And I listened to a couple of their branded podcasts as well, which were very good, by the
Yeah.
way. So they were making branded podcasts for companies like, I don't remember, tech companies, like antivirus companies, where they would talk about the concept of the company itself, or the specific segment that they were operating in. Seemed like a fairly sustainable model. It was working out, right? And when Gimlet got acquired, it wasn't like a distress sale or anything. It was a very solid growth
Yeah, it's a
momentum
good company.
business at that stage. So what I'm just trying to say, I don't remember exactly when Spotify acquired Gimlet, but Gimlet was doing well when it
Yeah.
was acquired by Spotify.
Yes, yes. It was
Uh,
it was a win-win for both sides at that point.
it was a win-win for both sides. So while we could
Spotify
say that
wanted original content that they could control. They didn't want to just be the distribution platform. They can't do
exactly,
that in music. They can
exactly,
never become
yeah,
a music publisher, right?
yeah, yeah.
So they said, okay, podcast,
So
because it's so disorganized, we can potentially become also a actual publisher and content owner. That's
right,
their
right,
play
right.
there.
Yeah. And so they did a bunch of acquisitions, right? They acquired these production shows from Gimlet and Parcast. They also went in the other direction, where they got like a Joe Rogan on board,
Oh, okay.
paying him
I
what,
was
$250
talking about,
million. Yeah.
I was saying they also went to the production side and got off Anchor and Megaphone or whatever
Right.
it was. So they
Which
started
was more the creator
from
side. Yeah. So
kind of things
they
saying, okay, we'll create all the base. Now everybody else come and create. Yeah, go
correct, which was
ahead.
which was all good, right? So getting Anchor to make creation sort of easy, and in fact, all of this happened at this was all phase three,
Hmm.
really, where they were democratizing podcasting, so to speak, where anybody could come and create a podcast. And I think they also had that sense that the bulk of the podcast universe is going to be talking heads, people talking to each other. This was around the time that podcasts like Andrew Huberman, or before that, even your Tim Ferriss,
Yeah.
became like the most popular shows, right? Which was just people interviewing other famous people and asking extremely good
Hmm.
questions and conducting great shows. In fact, Huberman was not even doing interviews. It would just be a 1 hour monologue on a specific health related topic, right? And that was good enough to become like the top podcast. So
You
the
can go
fair
back to
question that,
Mark Maron also, no? Mark Maron's been doing it for
of course, Mark
7 years.
Maron for many years as well, right?
Not us
So,
last podcast.
uh, so Spotify obviously asked themselves the obvious question, which was, do we really need these highly produced shows if we can instead get, great talking heads to do great
Yeah.
talking head kind of shows?
Hmm.
Which is where they went and paid Joe Rogan $250 million, right? Now, I don't know what a heavyweight episode costs to produce. It is obviously a high production podcast. In my opinion, one of the greatest podcasts ever made, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure most people will put it in their top five because there is no other podcast like it, right? It's so unique and so well done. It's a show that was discontinued by Spotify. It really was the crown jewel in their Gimlet portfolio, at least. And every other podcast in the Gimlet portfolio had anyway already sort of died. In some cases, a natural death, like Reply All. In some cases, the
Hmm.
shows weren't going anywhere. Heavyweight was the one show that they still had, which they in fact held as a Spotify exclusive for a
Hmm.
few years, right? Where you could only listen to it on Spotify. And then they relented and made it available on other platforms because they figured out that the exclusive strategy wasn't really helping out. And they eventually discontinued the show at the end of last year, start of this year, because they weren't able to figure out the business, the monetization, the numbers around how to make the show work. At the same time, they're also forking money out to Joe Rogan and to Meghan Markle and to the Obamas and so many other,
That's your
with all
usual
due
branding.
respect,
Half of that
bullshit
is,
talking heads.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's effectively
Uh,
marketing. Half of it is to just to be able to say that Obama is on our platform or whatever. Right. Some of that.
which didn't do anything for their platform, right?
Not
One
true.
thing that
Yeah.
Spotify learned the hard way was you could not just get great people on board
Hmm.
and hope to have a great podcast.
Yeah.
You could have a great podcast on board, like, so getting Joe Rogan still made sense because it was already a very popular show, but getting Barack Obama didn't mean that you were going to get
No.
another Joe Rogan type hit. And these were expensive lessons, and the price was paid by heavyweight and by basically the Gimlet and Parcast family of podcasts.
in the end, this is still, I know it's a 10-year-old industry, but it's still I think we're still very much in the growing pains of
Absolutely. And
podcasts.
I think what Spotify also has realized is that it's tough to monetize.
Yes.
And if they're not really getting new users yet, right? They're obviously
Yeah.
getting new podcast listeners from
Hmm.
within people who
Yeah.
subscribe to Spotify for music,
Yeah.
which is what
So
we
it's
said,
helping
right?
them on retention of those users, but
It's
it's not
probably helping them
actually
on retention.
increasing revenue in
Yeah.
any way meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not necessarily reducing the cost, right? Because whatever music
Yeah.
labels that Spotify is acquiring, they're
Yeah.
still paying the same thing. So ultimately, podcasts need to start paying for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
They need to figure
Yeah.
that piece out. And yeah, so by the way, right, since we were talking about monetization, you said you're using Pocket Casts, right, for the last
Yeah.
few years. So
Hmm.
I, by the way, in 2012, when I first 2011, whatever, when I started listening to podcasts, I downloaded this app called Podkicker on
Hmm.
Android. Right, it's
Hmm.
one of the many RSS catchers, which is what it used to be back then. And I've stuck to Podkicker. Right, I like the interface. It's minimalist. It's a great power user interface. It
Yeah.
allows me to look at 50 podcasts. It's also a messy, in the sense it's a mess. Like I'm a messy user. Right, the app is not messy, but I'm messy. So unlike you, I don't actually look forward to, hey, okay, this episode is going to drop on Monday. This one drops on Tuesday. I don't care. Once every
I, by the
five
way,
days.
don't understand. Sorry, one second, I have to come in on this. I don't understand why none of these guys have created a calendar. Even fucking Pocket Casts don't have I don't understand why nobody's
Yeah.
created a calendar as a feature.
Uh,
You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
I know that certain podcasts drop on Monday and Thursday, but I'm going and finding them on that Thursday and listening to
Right.
them. I don't see why it's not coming as a programming calendar saying Tuesday. See, you'll get the notice that the new episode has appeared, but you're in the
Yeah.
middle of the day pushing it out.
I
But if
think
I see
one.
a calendar saying
I
this is
think
my
the
new
reason
episode,
is. I think the reason is a lot of
they
podcast creators don't actually stick to schedule,
don't
right?
follow a calendar, which
And Bits
brings
and
me to
Pieces is a great example, right?
yeah,
We've done 113 episodes now, right? We just launched
yeah,
up to say 112 episodes. We've been at it for 2 years, right? We do one every
mm,
week, every weekend.
yeah, yeah,
Even for a calendarized episode, a calendarized podcast that has actually been very, very, uh, strict with keeping
mm,
up the time. Our
yeah,
episode sometimes drops on Sunday, sometimes it's Monday, sometimes it's Tuesday, sometimes it's Saturday. And this is
yeah,
because we are a sports podcast, right? If a match is going to end, if a test match ends on Monday, we're not going to drop the episode on Sunday. We're going to wait for that match
yeah,
to end.
yeah.
So, and I guess a lot of podcasting is like that, and hence you don't have
That's the other thing. The
solutions built for this.
if the supply side is
Exactly.
so disorganized,
Yeah.
then you can't clean it up for the other side as well, which is the other thing that the industry is missing, right? We are, as an industry, it's completely
Amateur.
uh, amateur and
Yeah.
disorganized. People are trying to bring their own system, but you can't have the system people sitting with the non-system people, and you cannot have an
Exactly.
output for these guys that
Yeah.
then tries to work for them.
Yeah,
Which
right
also,
now there are probably two kinds of usages, right? There is the inspiration use case where you probably open your app and see, okay, what are the latest episodes that are there in the 5 podcasts I've subscribed to, or Spotify or whichever platform says, hey, you listened to this podcast the last time, you probably will like this episode, so listen to it. Or
yeah,
there is the power user behavior, which is what you and I don't know about you, you're like the sophisticated power user. I'm the messy power user who probably I open Podkicker and refresh it once a week. And I
uh,
see what are the 500 episodes that have landed in my feed from the last time I refreshed to now. I go through
yeah,
that list and I download maybe 100 of them.
yeah.
And by the way, I download my episodes. I don't know why I do because I used to do it in 2012. I don't need
I
to
download
download
now
them
also.
anymore. I can just stream them. You don't
I
have to.
download them now also, but I have kept it on auto download. So the ones I subscribe, by the way, I don't know why you keep. What is the difference?
Because I don't know. I just don't like downloading stuff that
This
I
is
don't
what
want
I'm
to listen
saying. So
to.
all of these behaviors are very different. Everybody's
They're very
created their
quirky.
own behavior. I am messy in my own way, by the way. It's not like I remember Monday and Thursday, but every time I open in the morning,
Yeah.
I scroll through, and half the time, by the way, there are some times that I remember what day it is because that podcast is like in the morning, it's a habit. Like when I wake up,
Yeah.
I scroll through to see what has come, what has not come. And at that point, I figure out, oh, okay, this has come. And then I say, I have to listen to this one today because it just
Yes.
dropped
Yeah.
late last night in the US. So now I'll listen to it today. That's not to say I wait for a Monday and know that this episode is coming. But
Right.
there are a few of them that I listen to live, quote unquote, live or as soon
Yeah.
as they drop, so to speak.
As soon
So
as you have the time
hopefully
to
I'm
listen
also
to it,
this,
right?
but that this is all part of the same, like listeners are as messy as the creators,
It
and
is.
therefore these apps are able to keep up with that kind of behavior. And therefore, I think even monetizing suffers for this reason because there's no clean.
Exactly.
If you say TV shows, movies, they have like a very fixed way of coming out. There's a very like there are clear. It's a half an hour episode. It has fun. Streaming has fucked around with some of that. Let's keep that aside for now.
Yeah, but that's
But
not, I mean, it's the closest parallel is streaming, right? Because this is all
yeah,
catch-up content. You're not going to come at 7 p.m. to watch the show, which will have two ad breaks anymore, right? Nobody's doing that
yeah.
anymore.
But depends what it is, right? If it's like sports, people still listen on time. One of the reasons Bill Simmons and Ringer is so big is that the people
The
listen to
preview
the
show
sports
to
ones
game,
immediately after
etc.
because it's sports. It's again back to the one true content that
Yeah,
only works live, technically. Like sports is going to keep broadcasting alive in the world. It's going to keep at least appointment podcasting or appointment anything else to the extent that that needs to be kept alive, kept alive. Uh,
it's perhaps, yeah, I don't know. Maybe Bill Simmons is very sophisticated in the way they handle
but
their
even Bleacher
podcast.
Report and all that, the sports podcasts, because they are sports podcasts,
So
because they
what
talk.
I'm seeing with at least with cricket podcasts, and I listen to about 10 of them, is that yes, there will be. So during a test series, for instance, where you have test matches happening and 5 days of play, lots of the popular podcasts will do dailies, which they don't otherwise do. But just for the England tour of India, they will do dailies on every day of
Mm,
play. But even within the dailies, the time when the episode drops won't be fixed because
yeah,
there will be production delays. There will be the topics that need to be spoken about itself might not get fleshed out until the game actually ends and recording starts after that, and then production and
yeah,
all of that, right? So yeah, there is still variability over there.
mm.
But
There is.
I've been using Podkicker now for 12 years, right?
Mm,
I'm probably their biggest power user in the world.
mm,
Right? It's not a big app. Nobody's probably heard of Podkicker at all, right? I've seen their app evolve over a period of
yeah,
time, right? So I've started seeing ad placements coming within episodes on Podkicker, which never was the case. I now see geo targeted ads, right? I see Dubai specific ads coming to me because I'm living in Dubai, which I find pretty cool, right? I don't know if Google's at the back end of this or who's at the back end of this, but this is something new. It's something I've only noticed in the last 2 or 3 years, where you actually are getting targeted ads, digital ads.
yeah.
I also started seeing Podkicker now start, if I open the app after a long time, they are pushing me to become a paying subscriber because as a paying subscriber, there are certain things I can do which I cannot do on the
Mm,
free version of the app. And I think every other podcatcher or RSS catcher, which is how all of these people started,
yeah,
probably operate this way. This app used to be very, very basic back then, right? I would have to go and Google for the RSS feed, get
mm,
that garbled leet based
yeah,
URL, come and
yeah.
paste it in here and hit
It's,
subscribe and then wait. And very often the feed would not load, right? So there'd be some issue with the feed, and then I'll have to go somewhere else and search for that feed. Now it's just become a place where I can type in the name of a podcast and
yeah,
it'll give me the result,
it's
right?
pulling from a directory, whatever.
It's
Yeah,
pulling directly from Apple or from Spotify or whatever. But yeah, that's where we are right now. By the way, it's very interesting that we chose today to be doing this episode because I was just Googling, or rather, I was just looking up on Twitter what's happening with Gimlet and Spotify.
yeah.
Right now, today, there is a collective bargaining sort of fight
Ringer
that's going
union
on
is
between the
backing.
Ringer, Gimlet, and
Ringer union is
Parcast
backing.
unions, which have all come together against
Yes.
Spotify because Spotify have been laying off people left, right, and center. So these
Yeah.
people are bargaining for better severance terms, better
Yeah. Yep, yep.
benefits, and and that
It's
apparently
been
today was
happening.
the last day. Today is
Yeah.
apparently the last day, and the talks have not really yielded fruit. So they're going
Yeah.
into gray
Couple of
zone right
days
now.
ago, they sent a form letter saying,
Yeah.
please write to Spotify. They said, "Well, click this link, write your name at the bottom, and click send it." So they made a full tech thing that would send out like support letters of support. I sent that also.
I mean, it's also very
Yeah,
telling
that's
that
cool.
the three groups that are actually
Yeah, yeah,
fighting are the three
yeah.
companies we spoke about, which were acquired,
Yeah,
right?
because
So
they're the ones they've employed from outside. Oh, well, they're the only ones doing any production. So like everybody's sitting out there and they're still hanging around from vestiges of the
yeah,
Gimlet
lots of
and
them have been laid off. They're worried
yeah.
about AI coming into production of
Yeah.
podcasts and all of that, right? So yeah.
And I have seen in the last 2 years the quality of edits going down.
Hmm.
The cleanliness of what the episodes were 2 or 3 years ago.
This
Speaking
is
purely for because I've been listening
Ringer
to Ringer
podcast.
from
So
I'm talking purely Ringer from day one till now. I can see the quality has gone down simply based on the fact that the producer is now doing so many other shows, and I think there's a Spotify pressure to say release the episode now.
Yeah.
So they do literally one pass on it. They add whatever they need to add. They take out any big errors, like
Yeah.
if they're not to speak about something. They do segment edits, but there are so many, like forget at one level, coughs and things like that are there. That's fine. It's small. It's an error. But also, like a little bit of restarts and all, they don't even bother cleaning it up anymore. I'm going to take that again. They take it again. They don't
Yeah.
do it very bad. They've been doing it for years. The
Yeah.
hosts also are experts. So they don't do a take two like we are doing a take two, where we take two like after a sentence and a half in. They're starting their take two like 4 words in. So it's much cleaner comparatively. But they're not even cleaning out those that take two of it. They're just like, yeah, whatever.
Understood.
It's because Spotify has also realized people are listening, big deal, which is
Yeah, they
fine.
don't
By
care. Yeah.
saying that's a
That's fine,
problem,
by the way. Yeah. Yeah.
that is fine. This is talk radio effectively. So as long as the voice is legible, it's totally. We have gone through that cycle, right? Remember when I used to sit and clean every like an hour out of it, and now we're like, yeah, whatever,
Yeah.
it works as long as the point is being made. This is not the same for a high production show. The high production show can't do this. Then it completely loses value.
Yes.
Not loses value, but it becomes shitty.
Yeah.
Whereas this is a
Talk shows can live with this.
91% to 92%, there's not much difference. But this makes a massive difference in the production. Now, if you're saying all you want is volume, which I'm presuming Spotify wants, is to create minutes of content existing
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to juice every producer for, you need to like you're measured on 4 episodes published a day or something like that, whatever that number is, as opposed to we want to make a good episode that has the right kind of clips, that has the right whatever.
Indeed.
And these
Yeah.
episodes also, they add clips, they put sports clips, they put whatever. They're doing all of that. It's not like they're not doing that. But you can clearly see the quality has dropped over time. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, I know we have discussed the idea of high production versus talk show, and we put them on opposite sides of the spectrum, which from a production perspective, cost perspective, they are on opposite sides of the spectrum. But it's not like they can't exist in the same space. You look at an HBO, it has both
Yeah.
Game
Right.
of Thrones and John Oliver. Okay, so
Right.
talk shows also exist on TV. TV broadcasters or whatever have figured out how to
Yeah. It's a
monetize
good example.
Mixed
Yeah.
broadcast and HBO, but all of them have realized how to monetize. The problem is this:
Yes.
monetizing current way that people have figured out to monetize or whatever that is a one size solution that they have found, that they're trying to forcibly fit to 20 different types of content.
Yeah.
The extent that one way that they're able to monetize, I'm saying
Also,
one, but people haven't figured out the right kind of monetization for the right
yeah.
kind of show. When you figure that out, then you'll be solved. But that requires that much of.
That's an interesting point, right? So when you talk about Game of Thrones versus John Oliver, what are the different monetization methods there? Isn't it fundamentally the
HBO is
same
not a good
monetization
example
method?
because HBO is direct to subscriber model. So HBO is not a good example. Let's go to, for the sake of being correct on this argument, let's go to like an NBC, which is a broadcaster, and say Tonight
Yeah.
Show with Jimmy Fallon or CBS with Colbert versus NBC's whatever TV show, let's say This Is Us, or CBS has some
Yeah.
Star Trek or whatever it is, right? Those are the right, just to be completely correct before
Fair.
somebody says. I think the difference in monetization is the kind of brands you're going after, the people who know what that audience is. You know who the audience is also. So
Understood.
people
Yes.
listening to Jimmy Fallon at night are a particular kind of audience. The person listening, watching, like I said listening, watching Jimmy Fallon, whereas the person watching a comedy show, you
It's a
know
very
the
different
customer
person.
segmentation,
Yes.
which means you know what brands need to go there. Podcasting has not reached that point where we know the difference between a comedy
Yeah.
listener. So this thing,
So
there's not
everybody is getting pitched either MailChimp or Athletic Greens.
yeah,
That's the
everybody's getting
problem.
MailChimp, everybody's getting whatever that sleep Casper mattress. There are some 5 brands.
Now
There
it's
are some that
Athletic Greens. Yeah. But yeah.
for that matter, you see, Mark Maron is still doing stamps.com. He's
Yeah.
recently moved to, he was on Earwolf. He's now moved to this thing. What is that British one? Acast.
Right. Yeah.
There's a company called Acast also.
And
He's
he's still
moved to
doing
Acast. He's moved to
stamps.com.
that
There's
model.
a Mark
He's
Maron
still doing
joke in the
stamps.com.
middle
So
of
all that
everything.
has changed. He's still doing stamps.com to then to now. They must be getting returns. They're paying. He's
No,
still
must be,
making
yeah.
it. But it's now the ad sale is going through Acast instead of Earwolf, what it was going through earlier. So he's just moved his account from one place to the other. But clearly, some people are seeing returns. It's working for them. But that aside,
Yeah.
I think this is the problem. We don't know And here's the question. What is a heavyweight listener? You and I are listeners of potentially both. That's
Everything.
fine.
Yeah.
But we're also watchers of Game of Thrones as well as
Yeah. So we are not the
we are
example.
not the right. Who is the person who only listens to heavyweight versus
Joe Rogan
only or does not listen to Joe Rogan and listens to
and
heavyweight
vice
while
versa. Yeah.
that has not been figured out. When that
Correct.
gets figured out, they'll hit the right brands, then they'll hit the right. That will give the right kind of the heavyweight brands have to pay you more to be sitting in that episode because they're more affluent, they care about quality, whatever. All of that math has to work out, and that matching has to happen between a customer and its and the brand that's advertising to it, versus talk radio where it's fine, anything goes, and whatever you pay us is fine because anyway our cost of production is not what we are trying to cover. Then if we have a lot of listeners, we'll start increasing the price, but we're no longer trying to cover cost of production.
Fair.
That problem has not been solved. That problem is solved broadcasting because they've been doing it for 20 years and whatever billions of dollars. Audio ads itself have not grown that much either.
Yeah, true. So the other issue between the NBC HBO comparison and Spotify is NBC has limited inventory, right? Even for
NBC has
content.
not.
And
But
it's
you
not a
can say,
platform. It's not a platform at the end of the day. Like I can't go and launch a show on NBC or on HBO
yes.
for that matter. And NBC doesn't want me to also.
Yeah.
Spotify, on the other hand, wants me to, is empowering me and is hoping that I'll make a good show as well, without actually
Which
having
only
any
muddies the
control on
water
that.
more, no? If you don't know how to advertise heavyweight versus Bill Simmons, how will you know how to monetize some random you and me doing intermission podcasts?
Exactly. Which is also a difference
Everything is
between a platform and a channel, right? At the same time, Spotify is trying to be both and creative studio at the same time, while also trying to figure out the AdWords model for it, which doesn't exist. So that's.
But to its credit, it's also the only thing at scale trying to solve these problems. Now it's doing a fuck all job of it. I think you and I will agree.
Apple to an extent was doing the same thing, right? Except that Apple didn't care. It's not like they were trying to rebuild the world of podcasting or anything, but they created the basic furniture and put it out there. They didn't create a studio. Fair enough. But everything else Apple had, and even now, and I was reading somewhere that even now, Apple has more podcast listeners on Apple than on Spotify, right? Which puts into perspective all the efforts that Spotify has taken, which I guess Apple users, at least globally, still default to Apple for whatever they're listening to.
And here's the other thing I wanted to add as a wrinkle into this, what we've briefly touched upon earlier, is now YouTube getting into the podcast game.
Exactly.
Both on an audio level as well as the video podcast level.
Yeah.
As envisioned by us right now here doing a video podcast. You've been doing it for a while. We're doing it now. But this is also a very recent phenomenon. This
In
is
fact,
not
I'll go a step higher here and even question, why does Spotify have to exist? Because it's something that it's a realization I came to recently because I've decided to discontinue my Spotify subscription. Partly actually irritated by the fact that heavyweight was discontinued more than anything else, right? Fundamentally, principally, it feels wrong to be paying money to a company that has killed my favorite podcast, is how I look at it, right? In fact, the reason I even took a Spotify subscription was because I started using a Garmin smartwatch or a Garmin fitness watch. And the only music that Garmin would support, and this was a watch that would allow me to actually sync playlists and listen to them while running, but it would only sync with Spotify as one of the platforms. That's the reason I took, and that would not work with a free Spotify subscription. I have now realized that if you have a YouTube subscription is the best subscription in the world.
Is the greatest thing.
It is the greatest thing in the world.
Our missing co-host Videep, who was busy today. But I'm on Videep's family plan of you get 6 people in that family plan. He had used it. He said, "Do you want?" I used.
Excellent.
It's
a life changer.
Some 2 years ago, he gave it. I said, I don't really care about ads and all. I have not seen an ad on YouTube in the longest time.
And it changes your life. It completely changes your life, right? It is.
I'll tell you how YouTube it really destroyed me. Sorry, I landed in Portugal 2 years ago. About a month later, my YouTube Premium stopped, and I got a mail saying, "It seems you're outside your home market or whatever." This thing. I was like, "Oh no, my life is destroyed." I started seeing ads. It was suddenly so jarring.
You can't go back to it.
Then I sent a mail saying I've moved something, this, that, and now it's restored. But so I'm still on his plan. But if it stops, I'm going to pay. It's very simple.
Yeah.
YouTube Music then was an add-on to that. I anyway don't listen to music, but I've got the YouTube Music app and I listen to that also whenever I listen to
The
music.
YouTube has a bigger library of music than Spotify ever will have,
Yeah,
by the way, because every song is launched
yeah,
on YouTube.
yeah,
Every song is launched on YouTube.
yeah.
And you don't really need Spotify for podcasts, right? Spotify has also realized the exclusive strategy doesn't work. So all
Yeah, yeah.
Spotify podcasts are available everywhere. So regardless of whether podcasts are on YouTube or not, you can listen to them easily wherever you want to. And for everything else, YouTube is the answer.
I'm not a music listener, but the big thing that Spotify cracked when it cracked it was that entire playlist idea. You're able to share your play, which you can do on YouTube also.
YouTube does a
It's just that
fair.
people got used to doing it there, and now people got used to listening to it. Part of it is just the habit of, oh, that's a place where I do this, which all of these apps struggle, right? Even YouTube tried to do scripted content, which like Cobra Kai couldn't survive on YouTube and had to go somewhere else.
Uh,
Sometimes some things just become the place where you use that thing, even if other apps
yeah,
allow that functionality, even if existing apps for the longest time have allowed that functionality. For some reason, you discovered that functionality here, and then this
yeah.
is the place you're doing it.
And
So
see, Google
Spotify
has been
went
in
on
the
that
news.
playlist. People are sharing their playlists around, which they,
And
part of
Spotify
it is
doubled down, right?
virality of saying
Spotify
you can
also,
share.
yes,
It
yes, and
cracked that.
Spotify doubled down on it, right? With their Spotify Wrapped
Yeah.
and other
Yeah.
strategies.
So
They
they
also,
cracked that scene. Based on that, they were able to pull on a bunch of other things and they became the
yeah,
dominant music listening app. For music listening, they said now we want to become the dominant listening app. But now
which is
YouTube is
fair, right?
mustering it from the side.
Yeah,
YouTube is
see,
doing to them what they did for their music. They moved their music people to podcast, what we just
correct,
discussed a little bit ago. YouTube is now saying all our YouTube watchers will start watching some podcasts and screw you, will
exactly,
get the podcast creators to make video. Boom.
and
So they
done.
are taking over this bunch. So you can't compete with YouTube at that point. So it's a
And
matter of
yeah,
time, I
which
think,
is
unless they figure something else out.
because Spotify now allows you to upload videos
Yeah.
as podcasts, right?
Yeah. So it does.
So that's Spotify trying to take on YouTube, which is the only one company is going to win that battle, right?
Hmm.
Google has been in the news for all the wrong reasons in the last couple of weeks, right? With their
Hmm.
launch of Gemini
Yeah.
and all the shit that has been going around. And people
Yeah.
have been saying some very unsavory stuff about Google, I think partly justified, about how the
Hmm.
company has really slowed down and become a seemingly lazy behemoth that is sitting on its laurels, while, other companies are probably moving faster. And to my mind, the fact that YouTube has just not gone and killed Spotify is another
Hmm.
example of Google just sitting there not doing anything,
Yeah.
because
Not giving.
they just have to snap their finger and Spotify
Yeah.
can cease to exist.
Yeah.
Right? There is no reason why YouTube cannot be the destination for music and for listening. It's just that
But Google's famous
they
for
don't
this.
realize that they can be it.
Google should have been the Facebook. Google should have been everything. We have seen like 10 versions of their social network coming and dying and all
No,
that.
so
But
I
this
can
is
buy
closer.
social
Social
network, right?
network
I
is
can buy
still more
social network.
complicated.
See, social network is still a network problem. You need to get people. People are
At
your
least on my
content in
email.
a. Yes, but email is not the way people really.
The reason WhatsApp won the
Yeah,
IM game is because it had
because it was
access to
not
my.
email related. Fair enough.
It was so there's no
But the
reason why
difference
Google
here
should
is,
not have,
but the
but
but the
they,
difference here is we're talking about the content game, and
yeah, this is very
specifically
clean.
music content,
Yeah,
right?
this is very
YouTube
clean.
already
I
has
fully agree.
10x the content, so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Patreon is something we should talk about also. There
Buy
are
me a
people,
coffee. Yeah.
there are people making significant amounts of money on Patreon. Obviously, there is a wide gap between the Taylor Swifts of a Patreon versus the average person, but there are people making significant amount. Again, and as we were talking about high podcast listeners, there's literally one podcast I pay for. That's Blank Check. I pay
Hmm.
$5 a month for the Blank Check Patreon. So the one side I have the regular listening that I do, the free Blank Check anyway. Their Patreon feed also I listen to, which has separate special episodes. I looked them up recently when we did this YouTube thing last month. I wanted to look up what will happen. By the way, I've set up our Patreon and all, so that's a separate story.
Ooh.
Put anything there, but I took the URL and everything else. They are, I think, number 4 or 5 on Patreon earners and listeners. The estimate is somewhere near $30,000 a month
That's
off
solid.
of Patreon. That is not counting the ad sales that you do, which is happening on the
Correct.
free. So on free,
Which
they're
is
doing ad sales through Audio Boom, if I'm not wrong. But on paid, they're getting about $30,000 a month. No, what are we
no, this
talking about?
works. See, this works for the top 100 podcasts in the world, right?
Yeah, obviously it works for them. And you're talking about people who have like 100,000 listeners, of which
Correct.
even 5% do like $5 a
Which
month.
which they've built over a period of time, right?
Which they built over years, 100%.
Spotify sitting in
I
their
met,
meeting rooms is not going to build a blank check out of the.
yeah,
Literally,
yeah.
they can't get a blank check
No,
out
yeah.
of the blue. Yeah.
I met Griffin when I was in UK. I went for one of his other podcast live recording, and I spoke to him at the end of it. We sat and chatted. I said, I've started a podcast. So Blank Check is with Griffin Newman. I met
Yeah.
him, David Sims, who's the Atlantic this thing. I met Griffin and we chatted about some other. They had just done Danny Boyle, and I had worked on another Danny Boyle movie when I was at Searchlight. So we were chatting on some stories. I was like correcting some of his stories and all. So we chatted, and he said at some point we had to decide. I think this is a good way to end our conversation. He said at some point we had to, like, we were doing this, we were enjoying it, just like you spoke about when I was telling him that we were just enjoying and doing fun. At some point we started doing it more often. We started spending more time. Slowly then, because David is a Atlantic critic, Audio Boom came to us and said, you have enough listeners, why don't we take it over? We'll start selling ads for you. When we thought about Patreon and when we decided to go down that road, we then said, this has to work. We have to treat it like work at some level.
Yeah.
This can no longer be the hobby on the side. And so to treat it like work, we have to have one episode a week going on the Patreon because those people are paying money for it. It has to be something of value. If it means we have to, when we go on holiday, we have to bank like 5 episodes in advance, we'll bank. And you
So
hear that in the conversation. They're talking about, oh, this one's going to come out 6 weeks from now. They're literally like, they have everything calendarized 6 months ahead.
The only solution is to become one of the top 100 podcasts. Then monetization takes care of itself.
Yeah.
So
but that's
really
not
the onus is not on the platforms, right? You want to create great content, go out and create great content. That's the solution. Because the long tail solution doesn't exist. Which is probably true for every YouTuber as well, right? The people who really make money are the people with 1 million subscribers. If you're at 10,000 subscribers, you're not going to get a check from Google. They're going to make the money putting ads on your videos. So, right. So that was us on the state of podcasting, which is going to be released as a podcast. As you would have figured out by listening to this, both Dodi and I are strong haters of Spotify. So please go to Spotify, give us 5 stars for this podcast, and then promptly uninstall the app. And you can continue to listening to us on Podkicker, on Pocket Cast, or on any other podcasting platform of your choice, as well as on YouTube and on YouTube Music. So,
bye everyone. See you later.
Bye-bye.